Hi everybody, and welcome to part 2 of the previous video in the previous episode where we talked about the different terminology around funds and ETFs and stocks in general. And we talked about that there are a number of attributes we need to be looking at in order for us to understand if a particular fund, how it's doing, or is it a good fund or a bad fund for our purposes as average investors. So what I have here on my computer, I've popped up the Morningstar site, and by the way, that was a bit of a mistake when I said Market Watch. It's not the site that I like. I'd rather wanted to say Morningstar. And on Morningstar, it's an excellent site where you can check out pretty much any fund of any fund family from any of the providers such as Vanguard, iShares, etc. And let me jump in real quick. So if you navigate to the site morningstar.com, it's basically a giant search engine for stocks. As I mentioned, it has a lot of analysis, a lot of additional value add services. However, we're not going to be diving into those. I personally don't find a lot of value in them, so I'm just going to show you how I look up tickers and stocks so that we understand some of the basics about a fund. So if I go back here in the search box on the upper left corner, what I want to punch in here is, let's say, one of the most popular Vanguard funds, which is what's called its VTSAX. Okay, so it's VTSAX, and what you'll see, it will pop up immediately in the search box. That's basically the Vanguard Total Stock Market fund. That fund basically comprises, it's a single fund which holds all of the US stock market in terms of the large companies. Let me clarify that. So as I bring up that fund, there's a number of things that we can immediately see from this overview page, so to speak. If you take a look at the navigation here, within the fund, we've got several tabs on the side, and the first tab that we land usually is the quote. But I call this the overview tab because this gives us the quick info, the quick snippets that we want to look at before we dive into the more detailed sections outlined in the different tabs here. So if I take a look at the VTSAX fund, the very first thing I would like to see here is what is the expense ratio. I want to know if this is an expensive fund or it's an affordable fund, or rather if that management fee is below a certain threshold. So if we take a look here, it says the expense ratio for this particular fund, it's basically 0.04%. Now that's a very, very small number, 0.04%. The number that's represented here, it's already a percentage. So you divide this by 100 and that's what you basically have to pay. Then another part that I see here, right next to it, to the right, it already tells me that the fee level is low. And indeed, that's probably one of the lowest fee levels that you will see on pretty much any of the funds out there. So it is an extremely affordable fund to own, meaning it keeps more money invested and more money in your pocket rather than you spending money paying the expense ratios and management fees of fund managers. Now, it also gives me information about the category this fund belongs to. And what you'll see, it says it's a US fund large blend. Indeed, that's basically a fund which comprises all of the large companies, which can also be subdivided into smaller subcategories. So they can be a growth company, they can be a value company, but in this particular instance, the fund that I'm looking at is a large blend fund. And to the right of that as well, it gives us what is the investment style. And for all intents and purposes, it gives me that it's a large blend. It doesn't quite tell me what the investment style is per se, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that topic in a few minutes. Next, what I see here is that the minimum investment that is needed is $3,000. Now, that is the minimum for this particular fund. Not all funds have that minimum amount that you need to be investing. So it's good to keep an eye on this number and basically be aware of what you need as a minimum in order to buy this particular fund. We also see things like SEC yield. That's basically how much the fund is making. Usually this is like a number for maybe the last 30 days or something that's basically monitors the fluctuations short term. So I wouldn't really focus on that per se. Then another very important number that we see here, and by the way, this is not published for all funds, but in this case we do have it. It's the turnover ratio. The turnover ratio for the VT Sachs is 3%. That basically tells you that the people who buy the fund and sell it afterwards are very few. Only 3% of the people that buy it, they would end up selling it quickly or, in the next few months or so. That all translates into lower taxes that you will be incurring if you hold that particular fund. Because if a fund is traded very often and there is a high turnover, basically the fund will cost you more in terms of taxes. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Now, let me browse through the rest of the sections of this particular fund. So what I like to do immediately after I get a glimpse of what that fund is about, I like to go into the portfolio. So if I click on the portfolio, this will give me the breakdown of what this fund actually holds as part of the portfolio. Remember, this is a mutual fund, and a mutual fund, even though we're buying one share, it actually gives us the exposure, or we're technically buying, let's say, all of the US large companies. And in this case, it tells us it holds primarily US equities. Indeed, there is minimal exposure to non-US equities. There is no fixed income. Basically, that's bonds. There is very minimal amount of cash, some reserves for the fund, and then not classified. Again, there is no numbers. Now, next to our fund column, those are the numbers that we just went through, there is also a category column, which basically tells you if we're to compare this fund to a regular or the average large blend fund, these are the numbers for the average large blend fund. Going down the column here below. It's also compared to the actual large blend index. And typically what we want to see for good quality funds that are for passive investing, we want to see them tracking the index as close as possible. And as we see, our fund here, VT Sachs, it holds about 98.35 US equity stocks, which is pretty much the figure that we get in the index as well. Same thing for the non-US equity portion. So pretty much we can say the actual asset allocation is just as good as the actual index. And that's what we want. Now, looking to the right-hand side here, the stock style, it gives us a map of what is the investment style of this particular fund. And I'll just dig a little bit deeper into this. What you'll see is there's basically a square, and this square is divided into 9 smaller squares. So on the left-hand side, you'll see as part of the legend, if the fund is focusing around this box, bottom left, that's basically a small fund. If you focus in the middle, it's a mid-size fund. If it's going towards the top, that's a large-size fund. But then going across to the right, from left to right, the fund can also be evaluated against 3 other attributes. And that's whether that's a value fund, whether it's a blend, or whether it's a growth fund. So in our case, VT Sachs, what we can read from this map or investing style is that it's primarily a large fund, and it's also a blend. So it has a mixture of value stocks as well as growth stocks. So that's important to know. Basically, anything that resembles the S&P 500 is classified as a large blend. So scrolling down in this very same page, Morningstar gives us additional breakdown of what is the exposure of that fund according to different sectors, whether that's a financial sector, technology sector, etc. So you can look at that breakdown. And obviously industries that are hotter or more popular, such as technology and financials, they would have a larger chunk. But that's all proportionate to what the market cap representation is from industry perspective. Now, there are other charts on the same page here. Morningstar goes above and beyond and gives you all kinds of complicated analysis. I wouldn't bother with those. For me, those are, it's not something that I look at. Rather, if we scroll back up, let's go to another important tab here within this particular fund, and that is the price. So this gives us a little bit more insights of what it cost us to own that fund. And again, we mentioned in the very beginning, the VT Sachs fund cost us 0.04% management fee yearly. And what does that actually mean? Just to give you an idea, Morningstar has already calculated this. If you look on the table to the right, if you purchase $10,000, and by the way, these details are up here on the top on the heading of these charts. They basically illustrate that if you buy $10,000 worth of shares of the VT Sachs, assuming you get about 5% return yearly, for the next several year breakdowns, you can expect the following cost to own that fund. So for the first year, if you own VT Sachs only for 1 year, that will cost you $4. And that is dirt cheap. That's indeed a very, very affordable to hold fund. If you own the VT Sachs for 5 years, that will cost you $23 only. If you hold it for 10 years, it's going to be a little bit above $50. Now, these are very, very small amounts. If you consider the average active fund costs you between anywhere closer to 1 or 2% to hold it annually. So on a $10,000 for 1 year, you'll be paying a lot higher, $100. Compare this with the $4 you need to hold VT Sachs for 1 year. The difference is night and day. That's why the biggest thing you want to look at a fund is examine its expense ratio, so you know how much it's going to cost you to own it. Now, we understood how much it costs to own it. We know what the portfolio breakdown is. We know it's a large blend. We know it represents all the large US companies across multiple industries. Now, the next thing I would look at is performance. Under the performance tab, Morningstar gives us a picture of how the fund is performing against the index and against a category of average, basically, fund of this kind. And obviously you can enlarge this chart. It will bring up a bigger chart, which is a bit more interactive, so you can dig into that and truly understand the numbers. But what I like here in this interactive chart is I can change the time period. So I can take a look and say, okay, what were the returns of the VT Sachs fund for the last year? And I can see that the overall trend, even though there are some downtrends during the different months, it's still overall trending higher. And if I zoom out and basically investigate the last 5 years, you will see that the $10,000 invested in, let's say, October of 2014 until October of 2019, that gave me about $6,000 growth. In fact, the money grew to $16,681. Now, if I look at it at an even bigger window, 10 years time frame, and this is what I encourage you for you guys to invest in longer term, more than 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years, 40 years even. So for 10 years, the VT Sachs, if you invested $10,000 back in October of 2009, it would have grown to, check this out, it's a really high number, $34,219. So you basically more than doubled that $10,000 investment. Now, this is not going to happen every 10-year periods. In this 10-year period, we had basically the the bear market of 2008, 2009, so things were like way undervalued. Then it caught up with the market value and it grew naturally to a much higher value. So for 10 years, this fund awarded us with quite a substantial growth. So looking at this page as well, we can also see some breakdown of details of, again, 1, 3, 5 years returns. And you can even see larger periods. For example, the return for this fund in the last 15 years was averaged out 9.42%. Since its inception, so this fund has existed for quite a while, the average is 6.85. This is why when you look at historical returns, really you don't want to rely on just saying, okay, the fund for the last 10 years, it yielded quite a high return. I can expect the same return for the rest of, my investing kind of horizon. That's actually not true. And, the larger you go out, the larger window you look at, you'll see that those numbers average out to a much smaller number, but still it's within the 6 to 8% average return. So Vanguard itself, because this is a Vanguard fund, by the way, you can also go to the Vanguard website and punch in the same fund to basically see additional statistics. Let me go back, VT Sachs. Okay, so if I look for VT Sachs on Vanguard, I'll get pretty much similar statistics. Vanguard obviously aggregates them in some different ways. I still have an overview tab, which gives me the expense ratio. It's a large blend, minimum investment, etc. But I also get a little bit more information in some of those additional tabs. So if I go to price and performance, for example, there we would see some very, very interesting figures, which I like to highlight. So we saw in the Morningstar website how your investment would have grown for 10 years. Vanguard actually goes a step further, and if we look at the similar statistics, this is a table of the fund return, and what you'll see that Vanguard also gives you how much a total stock market index returns before taxes and then also after taxes on distributions and sales of funds. So those three rows of this table give you the actual return, the actual money in your pocket you will have if you had invested for 10 years. So we saw that the 10-year return was around 13%, but if we subtract the taxes that you get on distributions, your return is actually a little bit lower. It's shy of 13%. Then if you sell the fund as a whole, then you have to pay a little bit of capital gains tax, and that lowers your actual return to about 10.89%. Now, what does that look averaged out across since the fund's inception, which is about in November of 2000? So the overall return was 678, but if we subtract all the dividend taxes and the capital gains taxes when you sell the funds, the actual return is about 5.57%. Mind you, this is a very high quality, this is a very good fund, and that's a decent return for that time period. So I'll break here. I think we covered some of these basic attributes that you want to look at either on Morningstar or on Vanguard, or if you're buying Fidelity, you can go to the Fidelity site. If you're buying iShares, you can go to iShares site. They all publish some information. Mind you, I found that the Vanguard website is the most complete about their funds compared to, let's say, iShares, for example. And if we want to really look at across different fund families, the Morningstar site has them all, so it's a really good one-stop shop to look at funds. You can always look for additional material, you can look at the fund's prospectuses and things like that, but that's if you want to dig deeper. Overall, I believe looking at these several numbers and several areas within the Morningstar site would give you a good enough picture about the fund. If you like this kind of video, please like, comment and subscribe. I'll be more than happy to address any questions that you may have. At the very least, if you have friends or family that are also trying to get their investing get up to speed, how to invest or what they should invest in, please share a link to this video or any of my other videos. I believe they would greatly appreciate that. Until next time, I will talk to you soon.